Welcome back. You're still watching World Inside. I'm Tian Wei, the program coming to you live from Beijing. Despite the brief reprieve on tariffs, Washington and Beijing are still at odds over Huawei. The Chinese tech giant is suing the U.S. government, arguing that restrictions placed on the company are unconstitutional. The Trump administration has blocked the U.S. government from buying Huawei gear over allegations of so-called national security risks. Despite headwinds from the U.S., Huawei has accelerated efforts to make its own components, rolling out a new AI processing chip and introducing its latest phone, the Mate 30 series, in Munich on Thursday. But this time around, the world's newest mobile device will not have access to the world's top search engine, Google. Fighting the U.S. restrictions on accessing Google-developed Android, Huawei is developing its homegrown operating system, Harmony OS, for its phones. So how are the U.S. sanctions impacting Huawei? Caught in the middle of the China-U.S. trade brawl, what's the way out for the tech giant from China? For more on that, in Washington, D.C., we have Bruce Fain, former Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission under President Reagan, joining us in Medford in the U.S. We have Joe Trachtman, who is a professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Last but not least, in our Beijing studio, Jay Wang, founding partner of J-Stone Capital and former managing director of Intel China. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Fascinating topic, particularly with the rolling out of Mate 30, the latest mobile phone coming from Huawei, and the latest mobile phone coming from Apple. So, to you, Mr. Huang, witnessing all the latest development, what do you make of the latest move by Huawei suing the U.S. government?
I think maybe the best defense is offense. I think this is. I think the Huawei's motivation, I'm just guessing about it, is maybe try to find a place, particularly in the U.S. court system, to articulate his case. I think that could be one of the motivation.
Professor Fain, Mr. Fain, tell me more from a constitutional lawyer's perspective. Suing it as unconstitutional, does Huawei have a chance?
Well, there's always some chance, but I think it's remote.
That's very measured in your answer, it seems.
One of the arguments they've made is that this is a bill of attainder, that the sanctions are targeting Huawei. It's a punishment. It doesn't have any remedial effort to it. It really isn't based upon genuine national security. But our courts pay enormous deference to the executive branch whenever national security is uttered. One reason why our U.S. Supreme Court has permitted the building of the wall to go forward based upon what I think is a bogus national security claim. A more plausible claim is that the President's declaration that this is a genuine national security threat is really phony. President Trump on several times has indicated that many of the gestures made against Huawei could go away if he was able to negotiate a deal with China that would eliminate many of our tariffs and quotas currently imposed in exchange for China's opening up its markets, which suggests this really is a political gambit rather than a national security gambit. On that score, I think Huawei has a stronger case, but it's still an uphill battle given the general deference that the courts pay to the executive branch on national security matters. Now, we need to remember also that this case now in Texas is just one of the broader issues concerning Huawei. The United States is also seeking extradition of a chief executive officer from Canada, alleging that she was complicit in violating sanctions against Iran. And that's also a situation where President Trump has indicated, well, that extradition request could go away if there was a broader trade deal negotiated with China. Again, indicating it's politics rather than law that's spurring these particular sanctions.
We have already the constitutional lawyer talking, but Professor Trachtman, I want to come back to you as well. When it comes to international law, and international companies operating in different countries and economies. So how do you see this tug of war, quote unquote, between Huawei and the U.S. government, rather, in terms of the scale of business Huawei could do and the kind of partnership Huawei could develop with American businesses and governments, of course?
Yes. Yes. Well, there are three things that the United States is currently doing against Huawei. One is the export controls that apply to Huawei specifically.
Right.
And that's motivated by national security concerns. Another is a limit on U.S. government agencies purchasing from Huawei. And the third is an order by the president that has yet to be fully carried out that would limit the ability of U.S. companies in the telecommunications field from purchasing from Huawei. Now, all of those would raise WTO law issues, World Trade Organization law issues, by virtue of either discriminating against China or by virtue of imposing restrictions on either the import or export side in a way that would violate WTO law. But WTO law has a national security exception under Article 21 of GATT that will probably apply to allow the United States to operate the way that it wishes to here.
That is exactly, Mr. Trackman, Professor, that's exactly the vague part, isn't it? Because the national security issue has been, the meaning of it has been expanded in such a degree that nobody could exactly explain what is national security issue right now in the United States, particularly referring to its relationship with China or Chinese firms. So it's becoming such a vague area, and therefore can be manipulated in whatever way and whatever degree by whoever at any time. So despite the fact WTO could be a very complicated process, how do you see, as a lawyer about international law, on that part?
Well, the WTO has had a decision last year in a case between Russia and Ukraine, where a WTO panel said that they could judge whether the national security claim is real or not and whether it justifies action. I think in this particular case, there is a real national security concern. It may be that the United States will be willing to compromise it, but there's a real concern about cybersecurity in 5G and in Internet of Things. And this is a problem that the United States and China have to work out. And I think that Huawei has to find a way to make sure that its software is verifiable for security.
I think Huawei has so far, Mr. Huang, offered to work with the United States on whatever confirmation that they can do in order to make sure the other side will now have an unfounded suspicion. After all, the national security issue regarding Huawei has not been revealed as to what exactly are the contents of these issues and what evidence the U.S. government has about those concerns. So, Mr. Huang, when you have a situation like this, what do you think it would be the smartest choice that Huawei could have? I mean, on the one hand, obviously the legal actions are already taking place, as we said earlier in our discussion. But what about when it comes to its real business operation, when it comes to its global outreach?
I think if the national security is the real concern, without any political factor in there, this can be easily, in my opinion, resolved. For example, Huawei said multiple times they can open up their source code. People can come to check on every line of the source code. Secondly, for the telecommunications and the equipment, we know they have two parts. One is a core network, which is connected to the network. The other one is access network, which connect to the core network. Huawei made this very clear. If you suspect that my system has a backdoor, you don't have to buy my core equipment. You can buy my access equipment connected to your core equipment. By doing that, there has no security risk whatever. So I think this is a so-called security risk. It's just an easy excuse for political purpose. That's my personal opinion.
Now, Mr. Feng, obviously Huawei is trying to develop a different system in order to take the place when it is necessary of the systems that have been accepted all over the world, such as Android, because of the difficulty Huawei could have in the future doing businesses with American companies, Google included. So, Mr. Feng, are you concerned, even though you're a constitutional lawyer by nature, but are you concerned about a world of two or even more totally different technological systems in very different economies? So what would that mean for even the national security issue?
Well, I don't know whether it means much for national security. It's obviously going to be more costly for consumers. It's just more expensive because everyone's going to have a different niche rather than the economies of scales come when everyone is operating on the same kind of scheme. So it's going to balkanize, if you will, the market, which makes it, say, more expensive for everyone. I want to go back and underscore what are earmarks of politics rather than law that are at work in this national security declaration of President Trump. First of all, there are other countries that we've approached to try to get them to issue the same kind of sanctions and boycott of Huawei that we have. And several of them had said no. We do have leverage over them because we provide them military and economic security. But there's not a uniform consensus abroad that there is a national security risk. The second is that President Trump himself has repeatedly indicated that he's using national security in order to negotiate trade deals. And he's imposed tariffs and said Canada and the European Union are national security risks in sending us steel or aluminum, which is ludicrous. They're our allies. So when you put all those things together, that's what makes, I think, the national security claim very dubious, and it gives a chance for Huawei in the court litigation.
And finally, gentlemen, every one of you, before we go, 20 seconds if we can, what's going to be, the process we're likely to witness regarding Huawei and its relationship with the United States? Mr. Huang, from a tech perspective.
I would like to see, and we go back to this, Huawei can sell their equipment and to, U.S. and also in Europe, and also can buy the components and like computer chips and etc. from United States and anywhere else.
Okay, and Professor Trachtman?
I think that some of the things that the United States is doing are probably overbroad for the security rationales that are real and could be compromised. For example, many of the export controls on things like Microsoft Windows or Office software don't need to be applied. So there are ways to compromise, and hopefully that compromise will take place in connection with the trade talks that will allow us to trade with one another better. But I think in the long term, there are real cybersecurity issues that our two countries will have to work on in order to continue to trade.
Right. Last but not least, Mr. Feng, please.
Well, I think that the Huawei issue will be resolved in the context of the broader trade negotiations. I am very skeptical of these national security claims stated that the country is going to be crippled if any foreigner has access to some information. I think that that's never been true. It's never been shown that the United States has ever been crippled because of a national security breach. And I would like to see us just stop there and to have a world that's more open and more transparent.
Bruce Feng, Joe Trachtman, Jay Huang, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us.